Good morning, everyone, or should I say good afternoon, depending on where you are, and a very warm welcome to the third in our series of 5 raw material dialogues organised by Eurometaux this week as part of the EU's Raw Materials Week 2020. Our topic today focuses on selling sustainability and how should Europe start creating demand for low carbon and sustainable products. And as you can see, we're joined by a range of very representative speakers of the different stakeholder groups in this debate. Let me introduce them briefly. We have Alistair Graham, the Head of Sector Decarbonisation at Energy Transitions Commission, Georgina Hallett, the Chief of Staff and Chief Sustainability Officer at the London's Metal Exchange Group, Bjorn Ketil Maritsen, the Head of Sustainability at Norsk Hydro, key European aluminium producer, and last but not least, Peter Handley, the Head of Unit Resource and Efficiency and Raw Materials at the European Commission. Now, moving on to our next slide. I think if we can move on, please, to our next slide. Thank you. Some of you joined us a year ago. In fact, it was November last year, and one of our panelists, Peter, indeed, was one of our speakers there, when we looked at the issue of raw materials and low carbon with a large event in Brussels. And the cartoon you can see there will raise a smile for some of you that remember it, talking about climate neutrality on one side or business as usual on the other. And we heard a report there from VUB Brussels, from Thomas Wynne, a senior researcher, that identified the non-ferrous metals industry as a bellwether sector for decarbonisation by 2050. What does that mean? Well, it's the sheep with the bell around its neck that the others follow. What non-ferrous metals goes through will be the pathway that other sectors follow. Now, with that in mind, we've got 2 key questions that we really need to answer today. How can we start creating markets for low carbon sustainable metals and products? But in parallel, and not to be overlooked, how can we also ensure that that all European producers have that low carbon or decarbonised electricity supply that they rely on? So 2 parallel assets, I think, there to think about. Now, how are we going to approach this debate? Well, if we move on to the next slide, quite simply in 3 phases, really. First of all, I'm going to pose a key question in turn to each of our speakers and get their very short initial remarks to start off our debate. Then, bringing in questions from you, the audience, and a number of weapons I've got up my own sleeve as a moderator, we're going to push the debate forward, where the real meat in the sandwich comes with an interactive debate, a 3-way debate, like yesterday and Monday in this series, between audience, speakers, and me, the moderator, as the oil in the machine. Now, yesterday, like today, you might be watching down a computer line from your office or home office, but you're not alone. You're joined by over 250 people across Europe following this debate. And the same numbers approximately yesterday sent us over 60 questions. So hopefully you as an audience can bombard our panel with some good targeted questions in the same way. How are you going to do those questions? Well, if we flick on quick to our next slide, for those of you that haven't been with us in our debates on Monday or Tuesday, below your video feed, you have a simple area there, as you can see in the screenshot, to type a question. The questions are forwarded to me, and I'll do my level best to put as many of them as I can to our audience in good time in our debate today. So let's get straight down to business then. And as we have here, Georgina, Peter, Bjorn, and Alistair. And I'll kick off, if I can, with the first of our speakers. Alistair, very good morning to you.
Morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you're dialing in from.
Indeed, indeed. Now, a question to get us started, Alistair. I know that your organisation's published its Mission Possible report recently, and it sets out a global framework for global climate neutrality by 2050. Now, within that, for you, what's needed in the short term to establish lead markets for low carbon products where they're available at present, while at the same time also encouraging wider industry progress?
Thank you, David. That's an excellent question, and it's a pleasure to be in touch with everyone this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. So very quickly, the ETC is a commission of made up of major energy producers and consumers, as well as financiers and NGO experts, all committed to delivering net zero outcomes in the global economy, and in particular in the major heavy industrial sectors. Our most recent work reaffirms that it is both technically and economically feasible to achieve net zero by around mid-century, and that is without relying on permanent or large-scale offsetting. We believe it's technically possible because we believe that the majority of the technologies are either already available or at very high levels of technology readiness, and economically because our calculations suggest we're looking at something around 0.5% difference in living standard cumulatively by 2050 relative to business as usual. In order to deliver this vision, there are essentially three things. The first is using less energy. The second is on the supply side, the massive scale up of clean energy and clean energy provision. And then thirdly, the use of clean energy everywhere. We estimate we need around 4 times as much electricity in order to achieve net zero by 2050, or around mid-century. And if we're going to get serious about that 1.5 degree objective, we need to reduce emissions to about 20 gigatons of CO2 per annum by 2030. So it's absolutely critical that we make progress in the 2020s in order to give us a chance of the 2050 outcome. For all the non-ferrous metals, in the absence of globally robust carbon pricing, decarbonisation in the near to medium term is going to be cost adding. And so to solve this, you need a whole bunch of policy, a whole bunch of finance, and you need, crucially, demand signals for creating markets for differentiated products. So Peter, David, to answer your question directly, what we think is truly needed is a combination of voluntary markets, public procurement that scales over time, and then ultimately regulation-based approaches that trend towards life cycle emissions-based standards for products and finished products.
If I can just ask very briefly, and we'll go into this further in debate, for you, Alistair, the current framework that's in place and initiatives in place at EU level, do you see them? You said we need, okay, those voluntary markets, the public procurement, the regulation-based. Do you see that we're heading in the right direction?
I think we are, but not with the scale that is truly necessary. And we have to recognise that the public procurement approaches and regulation-based approaches in the longer term are a heavy lift, and they require a lot of complex discussion and discussions around trade-offs. So we think that in the near term, the initial volumes can be found in the voluntary markets, primarily in private business.
So you see a trend then of taking up the slack in the voluntary sense in the short term, and then bringing in regulation, medium to long term, to drive that forward. It's something we can pick up a little further in the debate. Thank you, Alistair. With that in mind now, I'm going to pass over to our second speaker, Georgina, giving us her views.
Morning. Thank you very much for having us here.
You're welcome, our pleasure. Now, Georgina, you're at LME, you're currently reviewing your sustainability plans. And I think very notably, it also includes a low carbon aluminium trading platform. And if I understand, this is a first, this is a historical first, at least from an LME perspective, and your due diligence requirements as well, even if they have encountered a little resistance from some industry players so far. How do you think these measures are going to support sustainability, while at the same time also balancing by keeping a level playing field?
Yes, thank you, David. You're absolutely right. We issued a discussion paper earlier in the year about our next steps in our sustainability plan. That's building on the work we've already done in the responsible sourcing area, where we have introduced requirements for all metals traded on the LME to meet internationally recognized standards for responsible sourcing. This is slightly different because it's not going to be a requirement for the metal traded on the LME. They are a voluntary system. So what we're proposing is to launch 2 platforms to support the development of sustainable markets. So the first will be about transparency, providing a centralized place for people to be transparent about the sustainability criteria that their metal achieves. And the second, to your point, is a trading platform to then allow people to make trading decisions on the basis of that information. So that, as you say, this will be the first time, as far as I'm aware, there is a centralized marketplace for that. And that's about enabling the market to build by creating centralized space for that trading to happen. And of course, the transparency and the open access of that will create a level playing field because it will be available for everyone. But you're absolutely right. There has been some resistance. And I think it's probably important to say that it's not all the same resistance. So we have people who think the LME hasn't gone far enough, and they'd like to see a full exchange traded contract for low carbon metal, starting with aluminium, because that does seem to be the focus in terms of the carbon debate. There's people who think we've gone way too far, and that the current proposals they perceive, and I don't think this is fair, but they perceive as being so carbon focused that it excludes other areas of sustainability, such as sort of human rights and other issues. And then there's people who don't sort of fundamentally object, but have concerns about the detail and how that's going to work, and the disruption to the existing aluminium markets. And all of that is completely fair. And to the cartoon earlier, the challenge of being a bellwether industry is that there isn't a mapped out path to follow. We are creating a new route, and that is difficult. And the LME's role here, I think, in answering the clear request that we've had from a lot of stakeholders, which is to provide some infrastructure to help the development of these markets, is to keep talking to everyone, and probably especially the people who don't like it, because that way we can refine the proposal and try and make sure it works for everyone and genuinely answers what the market need is, rather than the LME unilaterally imposing what it believes to be the right solution. So that's the work we're doing at the moment. It is difficult. I won't make any bones about that, but it's important work, and we're excited to be working with the market to do it.
Thanks very much, Georgina. And I think bearing in mind that our next speaker, Bjorn, comes from Norsk Hydro, which is one of the companies that did express a number of concerns initially about that, today's dialogue could also be an opportunity to clarify some of those points later on. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And with that link in mind, I'll pass over to Bjorn now. So Bjorn, if we can move over to Bjorn now, please. Thank you. So Bjorn, Norsk Hydro, as we know, is an aluminium company, and you have low carbon and high recycling product ranges available on the market already. Where do you see, from the experience of already having those, that regulatory actions needed to create demand? And where is the market already, or will already, take care of itself?
Well, thanks for having me. And I think your question is very timely, in the sense we are now at, I think, on a crucial point of the evolution of emission reductions, and also trying to define the next, kind of, we're at the intersection, the next pathway to carbon neutral Europe. And I'd like to start with a bit of a historic kind of dimension here, because if we look 30 years back, we see that emission reduction from industry, especially heavy industry, has been quite high, a substantial contribution. We have reduced the emission from our smelters by 70% since 1990 up until 2020. And I think there are three interlinked factors here. One is investment in new technology and improved operations. But another one is actually closed plants. We have shut down, industry has shut down quite a lot of plants in Europe. And I think also regulation has supported reducing emissions, not just on CO2, but also on other kind of local emissions. So all these three factors have contributed to reducing emissions. And I think today, when you look at heavy industry in Europe, we are much more energy efficient. And we have shown a significant reduction in emissions levels, and also specific emissions. But it has come at a price. Fewer people are employed in the industry, and we import more material as a consequence of less domestic production in Europe. So that's the kind of the back, I think that's the backdrop. And then I think what we need to ask ourselves now is, we look 30 years ahead towards 2050. So we kind of in the middle in this kind of, emissions accounting period from 1990 until 2050. So what are the next steps? What do we need to do now to go even further and get closer to or even below zero? Because I don't think we will reach carbon neutrality only from regulation the next 30 years. Regulation has served its purpose for the past 30 years. It will also serve its purpose, I think, to a certain extent going forward, but only regulation focusing on emissions, I think, will not be sufficient to get us all the way to zero in 2050. I don't think we can regulate ourselves into a low carbon economy, but I think we need different regulation then. And I think to get through the last stretch, we really need to use the market forces. Industry responds to price signals, and if industry is encouraged, is encouraged by the market, I think it will be an efficient way to go even further and get even closer to zero. And I think I think the next 2 or 3 decades, we need to think about a different type of regulation, not just pushing down emissions, but also creating a pull from the market. And there I'm encouraged by a lot of good initiatives from the EU. You know, it could be eco design, it could be PEF, it could be, you know, all kinds of different elements. And I think we're also seeing now, starting to see a growing interest from customers, not more focusing on embedded carbon in the products that they're producing. Up until now, regulation has been focusing very much on the use phase, so energy efficient buildings, and buildings are now becoming energy neutral, and of course energy efficient cars. Well, we are getting more and more electrical vehicles on the market. They don't have emissions in the use phase, and then focus turns on what is the embedded carbon footprint of the products when they're built and when they're on the road. So I think those are the most important. I think that's the most kind of important discussion we need to have going forward. Really, how can we use the market forces? How can we stimulate this green demand? Because I think that will probably also be needed in addition to the traditional kind of emission regulation you see through, for instance, the EU ETS or.
Okay, Bjorn, do you have a specific suggestion about what that regulation to stimulate markets should look like?
I think I don't think there is one single directive that could solve this. I think this needs to be worked in all the different sectors. For instance, and we also see there are a lot of initiatives in the different industry, but it's still quite fragmented. For instance, when you look at the buildings industry, there are a lot of certifications that work, but they are not. I think they're already, you know, they're also to a certain extent local in the sense that they are national, and I think more guidance and from the EU would be welcomed here, you know. And then you need to go into the details, you know, how do you actually calculate the carbon footprint? You know, are you going to use the carbon footprint of the actual metal that is used? Are you going to use averages and so forth? So there are a lot of details, but here I think we actually now start, and I think EU is going the right way, but we need to make sure that, you know, the numbers that are used, for instance, in these calculations, correct ones, you know, that are actually, you know, and so I think a lot of work is. I think there are a lot of good initiatives going forward. There is a long list of initiatives from EU, and I think EU, under the umbrella of the Green Deal, are really on the right track, and also now trying to kind of unleash the market forces, so to speak, to take us in a more kind of low emission towards a low emission economy.
Right, Bjorn, thanks very much. We're talking about unleash. I think it's time to unleash Peter now as well. Peter, it's not every day at the moment that we hear a call for more Europe. Yeah? These days it tends to be less regulation, better regulation. But Bjorn's actually, from what I've understood, saying we now need more Europe, but we also need different type of regulation now. Okay, something to bring forward into the debate. Anyway, Peter, very warm welcome to you. And looking forward, we all know that there are initiatives in the pipeline, initiatives coming from the European Union and from the European Commission itself to support markets for low carbon and sustainable products. We've heard an industry voice from Bjorn there, welcoming those and asking for those. Can you give us a little bit of a breakdown of what they're going to be in the future? What are these initiatives and what are they going to bring?
Yes, sure, David, and thank you very much to Eurometaux for organising this week of events during our virtual EU Raw Materials Week. The big picture is provided by the European Green Deal, one of the first things that the new von der Leyen Commission produced last winter. And it's about achieving climate neutrality, transforming the whole economy, but also staying competitive as you try to change the way that industry works today to how you want it to be a few years down the road. Last year, we already did some work with all the energy-intensive industries to produce this master plan for the competitive transformation of energy-intensive industries, and the non-ferrous metals played a big part in that work. So I agree with previous speakers. It's between a mix of market forces, industry initiatives, and where necessary, some European regulation. So we've already taken steps to eliminate conflict generating minerals from the market. So the EU conflict minerals regulation will take effect as of next January. Before the end of this year, we'll be coming forward with a proposal on the batteries, which will be an eco-design type proposal, which will interestingly not only look at performance, but also the environmental footprint, and it will include some due diligence requirements based on the OECD for the battery raw materials that go into batteries to be sold in the single market. So you can see we can do things to actually design the market. Then next year, in the middle of the year, we will come out with a major package, which is called 15 for 55, which is 15 measures to help us achieve our raised level of climate and energy ambition by 2030. This will include a reform of the ETS. It will also include a proposal on the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And then by the end of next year, we will come out with what we call the Sustainable Products Initiative, which is part of the Circular Economy Action Plan, which is very much about looking at the total life cycle aspects of products sold on the European market. So you can really make sure that downstream manufacturers have all the information they need, and the final consumer also can make choices based not just on cost or price, but on these European values.
There was something that strongly came up in yesterday's debate about instilling the European values into things. And it's clear that there's a very large portfolio of different actions being taken in terms of regulation and initiatives at an EU level. One question that does come up, and it's a question that our audience have already sent to me, in fact, listening to the four of you so far. And I'll put this question forward to all four of you straight away. Peter, you might want to pick it up, and I'd like to hear from the rest of you on this as well. Looking at this wide portfolio of needed and wanted and necessary action at an EU level, relating to production and products, how can we mitigate a risk that we lack a little bit of coherence? Because cards on the table, Peter, these are often managed by different directorate generals of the European Commission as a whole. So different parts of the organism are doing related things. How are we going to mitigate the risk of some potential lack of coherence between these and any issues that could bring?
Well, this is about governance inside the Commission to some extent. And I've just been looking at documents on precisely this question. We have a project team where the key parts of the Commission come together to see where all the bits and pieces come together and how you develop a coherent narrative. And secondly, we also have better regulation requirements. So all of these legislative proposals will be going through the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, which will be looking very much at coherence, cost effectiveness, and whether these things make sense. And they'll be looking at these things as a package. So I think we do our best. I was involved in the similar approach in the Juncker Commission for the clean energy package, and it's never ideal, but it's doable.
And I'm assuming also, if you'll allow me a quick follow-up, following what we've seen as similar action in other areas related to sustainability and other issues in the past, there's the idea now, it seems more and more, that there's a partnership approach. So if I understand correctly, you're intending also to bring in stakeholders right from the beginning, industry and others, into the consultation process on this, to make sure also that what comes out at the end is something that's really truly workable and joined up. Is that the case?
Yes, I mean, the normal way we do major legislative proposals, we produce a very short document called an Inception Impact Analysis, which is out for consultation and reactions. But then there's a proper 12-week consultation with all the elements to draw in what stakeholders think. And of course, we have specialized expert groups like we have the high-level group on energy-intensive industries, where we can have a more structured and ongoing discussion about the implications of new European regulation.
Okay, thanks. Right, well, we've heard initial views from each of you on this topic, and there's obviously a lot of positive thoughts coming forward from the initiatives from the LME here to create a trading platform for this. We've heard from Bjorn all the efforts made by industries so far. Alistair's given us this idea that technically it's feasible to achieve these things. but we do need that massive amount of clean electricity. A question for all of you here, though, so come in whenever you want, who wants to. There's a huge focus on low carbon here. Yesterday in our debate, we were talking about sustainability. And in fact, Peter, we were focusing heavily also on the conflict minerals regulation. And we're not going to risk that we need to mitigate here, that by focusing so strongly on low carbon, we're not actually properly including all the other aspects of material sustainability. I mean, the full value chain, from ethical sourcing at the beginning, right through to recycling at the end. And I'll just add a caveat, Georgina. One of the criticisms I heard of your proposal, in fact, from an Indian provider, a major Indian player in the aluminium market, is they're saying if you calculate price based just on production emissions, what about mining? What about the earlier parts of the value chain as well? And is that not the risk that you're going to favor companies and give an advantage to those that have low production CO2 emissions? Maybe because in their territory they have access to a lot of renewables that others don't. Do we not risk splitting things a little here? So I raised the question, are we focusing too hard on low carbon? And what about other sustainability elements? Georgina, I'll bring you in first on that if you don't mind.
No, of course, thank you. It's a great question, and I agree. A lot of the focus that you see in the media and at conference, etc., is on carbon. But I think that doesn't mean to say that there isn't a lot of activity going on in other areas. So I spoke briefly about our responsible sourcing work. That is consistent with the EU's conflict minerals law and the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chain. So it's a huge piece of work that is happening that isn't voluntary. It will be a requirement for all of LME's brands. It's obviously a requirement in the EU and so on. So that covers core issues like human rights, not doing conflict financing and so on, which at the time when we introduced it we started that process 3 years ago, was very much the focus. On our sustainability plans, I think this is one of the areas that, again, because of the conversation in the press is so dominated by carbon, that other aspects of our plan have perhaps received less attention. But one of the core principles of our strategy is that we've taken a very broad definition of sustainability. So we absolutely agree with that Indian producer you mentioned, that sustainability is much bigger than just emissions. And it's probably also worth noting that other metals, so low carbon is a huge topic, especially for aluminium, but each metal has its own supply story and they don't all have the same key issues, although clearly emissions are important for everyone. So with our broad definition, we're making it possible for people to list sustainability criteria on a number of fronts, not just relating to carbon. So, you know, talk about your tailings management, talk about your water management, talk about the work you do with local communities. That's all welcome and very much intended for that to be there. And then in terms of the trading platform, people who are not interested in carbon can equally search for tailings management or whatever it is they are interested in, the criteria that's important for them, and do bilateral transactions on that basis. The LME isn't setting a threshold. We're not saying you have to hit X tons or certain criteria to be on there. It's open for everyone, and you will set the price bilaterally between the buyer and the seller. So it's not the LME saying this is how much, to go back to it, low carbon aluminium is worth. That'll be for you to decide with the person you're buying from. So it may be that there isn't a premium for low carbon aluminium at the moment, but having that platform, having that centralized transparency will make it much easier for people to work that out. But like I say, it won't be limited to low carbon. It's across a much broader range of sustainability.
Okay, noted. Bjorn, I mean, Norsk Hydro had its perspective, obviously, on the LME proposal as well. How do you feel about what you just heard?
Oh, I think it's important to focus on carbon because, you know, if we're going to reach the 1.5 degree, we need to focus on carbon. That doesn't mean that there are other sustainability issues that are not important. Quite to the contrary. But I think now, I mean, there is a lot of focus on the political debate on the climate issue, so that's why there's a focus on carbon. Also, carbon is also fairly easy to measure and quantify, so it's a kind of an easy metric to use and compare companies on. And I think also, especially for aluminium, I think there is a huge difference in the carbon content of aluminium. I mean, the range here goes from close to 3 kilos CO2 per kilo aluminium if you have renewables and also have efficient smelters, 3 kilos CO2 per kilo aluminium, up until 20 kilos CO2 per kilo aluminium if you have an old smelter that is also running on coal-fired power. So I think for aluminium there is a very big spread in the carbon footprint, much bigger than in many other materials, for instance like steel or copper or PVC. But so I think that's why on aluminium it makes sense to have this focus, because you can make such a big difference if you choose a low carbon product instead of a high carbon product. But I think we start seeing, and we certainly report on I think we will start to see more focus on water. That's also something that is fairly easy to measure, as a metric. But then of course human rights, the mining, focus. We need to have full transparency on the mining side of aluminium business. So I think this is just, I think carbon is now kind of the most important thing, but I think this will evolve as we go along. Yeah, but I think we need to agree on how to measure carbon first, and then I think we can compete on it, and then I think other criteria will be added as we go along. But it's not that those are not important, but I think it's just a function of what customers are thinking about, what politicians are talking about right now.
Okay, Peter, is there anything you'd like to add on this? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that if you just look at carbon, you risk displacing the problem. And in fact, the risk could be that you concentrate so much on mitigating CO2 emissions that you push the burden into the material economy, and that we cannot afford to do. We have to address it in an integrated way. In fact, we need an integrated approach to the environmental, social, and the governance. An ESG approach needs to be there to balance the classic ways that markets look at things. We're doing our part through the sustainable financing. We're developing a taxonomy. We're already finalizing the work on the first phase of climate mitigation and adaptation. And now we've just started a new phase where the raw materials value chain, so the extraction, the processing, the refining, and the recycling, they will be looked at in an integrated way in terms of what kind of investments are going to be good for climate mitigation, for water, for pollution, for circular economy, and for natural ecosystems. I think that's very important. I think it gives signals to organizations like the LME that they can make use of.
Noted. Okay. I have another question that's come from our audience as well. And Alistair, I want to direct this one to you first. You mentioned, Alistair, in your introduction comments to my first question, that we need this massive upscaling of clean electricity. But at the same time, clearly it's the case that we don't have, although plans are in place to help facilitate this, we don't have it at the moment. And I quote someone recently who told me, David, it's all in the power mix. It's not in the company's hands solely. So if you're in a member state that doesn't have a high amount of renewables in the power mix, you can only do so much until that decarbonised electricity is available. So from your point of view, Alistair, and for the rest of you as well, how do we support producers in EU member states where they don't have a substantial amount of renewables yet in the power mix?
Very good question, David. I think the truth is that the resource assessments, at least in the European context, suggest that there is indeed enough renewables resource available. Whether the capacity is there is another thing. The other, of course, is that none of the countries in the EU are really, well, in a few months, really islands, and such that they're integrated into a major grid. That in itself carries costs, but of course is kind of the backbone of this. That will be the thing that is able to transport the large volumes of clean electric power around the continent. So there is the resource. There is the ability to move the resource from areas of high production to high demand. So that in of itself is unlikely to represent the critical challenge as we try to progress towards a net zero outcome.
You think that's something that can be achieved the way we're moving?
I believe it can be, and the EC is also it has provision for policies of inter-country or inter-member state projects of high importance, particularly in relation to energy provision, so that there are already measures and mechanisms that can help support the build out of the assets needed to deliver that clean electric power.
In fact, just on my doorstep, there's been an excellent example recently, an agreement signed between Germany and Belgium on that very area, in fact. I think it's a good example of that moving forward. Right, well, let's shift the focus of our debate just very slightly. We've touched upon quite a few issues, important issues already. But one question, or one series of questions, again, that the audience are showing me they want an answer to, goes a little bit away from institution and regulation, and it goes a little away from industry and industry action, and it looks a little at consumers instead. It's an interesting question for me, and this is for all of you, about effectively incentivizing the consumers themselves. Because clearly you've got to have a market for these low carbon products, and consumers are going to have to consume these. And so the question that's come from the audience, I think it's a fair one, is what's going to be the most effective way to incentivize consumers to buy low carbon products? Should it be just standards that we're setting? Should it be taxes? So should we be encouraging the market? Should we be driving the market? And what's the right way to approach this? I don't know who wants to pick up that little potato first. Peter, I might throw that one to you.
Yeah, well, we also looked at that whole role of the public as customers in the master plan that I referred to earlier. And part of the answer is making sure that people have the right information. So, you know, like when you buy a washing machine, you can see how it rates compared to other products. You can also see how much it's going to cost you to operate per year, and you can compare that. So consumers will need this kind of information. And I think also much better information going all the way upstream. So you can see, again, how much embedded climate, but also environmental impacts a given products have. So people can start to choose, make choices, and maybe say, I'm prepared to pay an extra 10 euros for a product because I feel better using it. Okay, this sends signals to the players in the market that they all need to up their game.
Yeah, so it's a little bit push-pull factors. In our debate yesterday, when we were talking more broadly about sustainability and looking particularly at responsible sourcing, and one of our representatives on the panel, in fact from the European Parliament, from the EPP group, was very adamant that consumers in Europe, as of today, and Georgina, Alistair, I do include the UK still technically in Europe at this point for this discussion, okay? As much as it pains me to say that. But joking aside, his argument was that this is what consumers already want, and therefore it is not really necessary to incentivize further. I don't know if you all agree with that statement, that actually there's already sufficient consumer demand such that we don't need to inform consumers further. Peter, you're suggesting perhaps that some form of labeling and information campaign for consumers would produce something valuable.
Yes, I think you need a clear methodology which is simple enough for people to understand. I'm not saying that in a superior way, because I'm also a simple person. If I go to a shop, I want to have things which I can understand. So you have to develop a methodology which is good at measuring the life cycle. You can also help to get things into the market using public procurement, of course, because that's maybe 12–13% of GDP. And if you do the right green procurement measures there, you can already create a certain amount of economic viability for those producers that want to produce the clean products. That also eases the transformation to help the non-public procurement part of the economy.
Just allow me a devil's advocate question, as you know I always do with you, Peter. I'm assuming then that all purchasing by all of the EU institutions in Brussels and across Europe already has strong sustainability criteria built into it.
I'm crossing my fingers and saying yes.
Okay, one would hope so.
One would hope so.
One would hope so. Right, Georgina, Bjorn, Alistair. So we touched upon earlier public procurement. So driving consumer, informing consumers to drive demand is possibly one avenue by which we can create better demand for low carbon and sustainable products. Do you think that that's viable or not? Should we be doing that? And also Peter's touched again, as was mentioned before, public procurement. And how do you feel about public procurement also taking the role? Alistair, do you want to come in first on that? What are your views?
Yeah, let me come in. So we need to be a bit clear, I believe, on what we really mean by demand. There's two things at play here. One is physical transaction-based near-term demand, and the other is demand signals, which the investors and the organizations such as Bjorn's need this market certainty that in 20x or 2030x, they will have certainty of an addressable market for that investment. And at the moment, they typically don't have that. So they have to make investments under very high levels of uncertainty, which leads to very high financing costs, and it's very difficult to kind of construct the business case, essentially. So those two things need to be broken apart. The other is around public procurement. Public procurement very much varies in its effectiveness. You have to go quite deep into the actual product classes and the product specifications to really understand where it can be best used to drive demand. The other thing that public procurement can do, which is very important, is its ability to kind of become quite normative, in the sense that if you are a large producer of a product and one of your largest purchases is coming from the public sector, it is likely to become easier to pivot your kind of procurement systems across to match that system. So there's both an indirect and a direct function from public procurement, which I think needs to be harnessed in order to actually achieve kind of the scale and speed that are likely necessary.
Okay, clear. Bjorn, what's your view on these issues of driving consumer demand with better information and also public procurement?
Yeah, no, I think Peter had a good example on the washing machine, because today there are quite good information available to consumers through regulation on, for instance, electrical appliances, but that's only in the use phase. There is no information available as of yet, or no regulation on what is the embedded footprint of this product. Yeah, and as things become more and more energy efficient, as I mentioned, for instance, electrical cars that don't have emissions in the use phase, the embedded emissions are becoming more important. And if you see this is a mobile phone. It has 31 grams of aluminium. But when you go and buy this mobile phone, it's very difficult to find out how much carbon how much emission has it, as a result of producing this one. So it's also quite complicated, because, in some of the products you have a lot of materials. Cars, for instance, there are a lot of materials, but typically, like a medium-sized car has one example is a Volvo I just saw has an embedded footprint of 8,000 kilos CO2. Yeah, that's how much it takes to put it on the road. But if you if you go off the three most important materials, aluminium, plastic or PVC and steel, if you went to only recycled material, you would reduce the embedded footprint of this car from 8,000 to just about 1,000 kilos CO2. Yeah, so there are some tremendous, tremendous gains to be had from this if you just focus on it. And I think consumers are now, I don't think consumers are aware of this. I think they are aware of the use phase effects of the products that they're buying, or the buildings. But I think now we need to switch how much carbon has been emitted in the actual production phase. And I think I hope consumers are ready for that, because once, I think this is the way we haven't exhausted, but we are, getting close to, energy. We have energy positive buildings, energy neutral buildings. Yeah, then the focus needs to be on the actual building. Okay,
noted. So definitely opportunities there. We touched upon this idea of embedded emissions as well, and another question I think that requires consideration, it's just coming from our audience, it's also very much in my mind as well. Ultimately, European production, and this is something, Bjorn, that you touched upon earlier, European production has gone down over recent years, which means imports have gone up. And imports come from places outside of the EU, which have much higher carbon footprints and other sustainability elements to consider. Peter, this maybe goes first to you, but not only to you. Is this properly factored into EU trade policy right now? I know there are parts of EU trade policy and trade agreements which try to mitigate this, But when we look at a player like China in the field of metals, for example, is EU trade policy doing enough on this, and is there scope for more?
Well, I think there's definitely scope to do more. As a sort of non-EU official, but as a person, it seems to me that our true emissions are not just what we produce, but also what we consume. So, if we're consuming goods which are 70% coming from abroad, then it's definitely relevant to look at the embedded footprint of what we're actually consuming in Europe. So we may only be producing, if you like, 8 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but I think our footprint is far higher if you factor in the consumption side of things. What we are trying to do is trying to level the playing field. And we do this partly through using trade policy very robustly if we see that there are unfair subsidies or excess capacity being created, which is definitely the case for aluminium and for steel. We also have been asked, and it's in President von der Leyen's program, we're going to develop an approach, the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is designed to, if you like, allow us to pursue our European objectives of a high level of ambition for greenhouse gases, but to make sure in changing our industry, we don't put our industry out of business, because anyone who wants to sell on the European market will need to respect our values. It's our values coming in again, right? So it's not about creating a brick wall around Europe. It's about saying, if you want to sell in this wonderful thing, which is the European single market, still one of the largest marketplaces in the world, you have to respect our rules.
Mm-hmm. And this, just to clarify, this idea then of really putting fully into trade policy with our partners around the world that we import from, this idea of our values as Europe in terms of emissions, decarbonisation, is this going to take the full life cycle approach? So right from one end of the value chain to the other, not just on carbon footprint, but also all the sustainability issues, the full life cycle, emissions, recycling, the whole package. Is that whole spectrum going to be represented, or will it be more narrowly just on emissions?
I think there's a range of policy responses to those different problems. The ETS will, by its nature, focus on point of emission in Europe. We haven't yet decided what is the best tool to deliver this level playing field in terms of the carbon border adjustment. And we're very open to reactions from sectors like the non-ferrous metals to give us advice on this. And we'll need other things to help us with the whole responsible sourcing and transparent supply chains issue.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to add on this issue of trade. I don't know, Alistair, if you'd like to come in on that, or Bjorn, you too. It's obviously a controversial issue always. It's something that producers, that players within the European market often complain, well, it's not a level playing field. And at the same time, we do rely on imports to a large degree. So, Alistair, do you want to come in on that, and then possibly Bjorn and Georgina, anything you want to add too?
Sure. So my abiding comment would be to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good on this. If you have something like a border carbon adjustment, it will, by almost definition, be imperfect because of the level of technical complexity and the number of trade-offs involved in its design. The other thing, of course, is that it will not really truly have the impact that's necessary to promote fundamental production process switching really before 2030, because if you look at the prevailing carbon prices, if you assume it's an extension of the ETS, which is currently the model that is being discussed, you're going to be applying EU ETS pricing to European and third country based production. That in of itself is not high enough to actually stimulate the changes in process that are needed in most cases. So we have to think about this as a medium-term solution. It's not going to be the thing that overnight changes everything, and therefore the industry need to have the support and make the necessary progress towards kind of the mid-2020s and 2030 by when a different kind of regime of carbon pricing is likely to be present, both in the EU but as other countries as well.
So for you then, very much in the medium term, yes, but long term, it's not enough on its own. Okay, Bjorn, what would your views be on this?
No, I think this kind of carbon adjustment, carbon border tax adjustment, is as a starting point an attractive concept, because it really emulates, from a region perspective, a global carbon price. Yeah, which, if we had a global carbon price, we wouldn't have an unlevel playing field. But I think we all know that the global carbon price is a long way into the future, if we will ever have it. But I think here, I guess it depends a little bit on industry structure as well. I think for the aluminium industry, when we look at this, we see there are some challenges, because it has to go through the whole value chain. So you couldn't just put it on imports of primary aluminium. You would have to put it on import of semi-fabricated products. And if you do that, you risk kind of putting European industry, moving it out of Europe. So you're basically down to, if you want this perfect, then you need to, as I mentioned earlier, you need to kind of, it needs to be, involve everything all the way down to the end products that are imported into Europe. But that might be possible, but I think we need to look, and I know the EU they're doing a lot of work on this, and industry is involved. So I think it's too early to say whether this is kind of the silver bullet. I think for now we focus on, of course, the need for free allowances on the direct emissions, and CO2 compensation for the indirects, to kind of to ensure we don't have a cost disadvantage, even though we have a carbon advantage when you look at European industry compared to where we are importing from. So I think it's too, and here I think different industry structures, how they operate, how much integrated they are in the value chain further down from the materials. It's different from sector to sector. So I think here we just have to see what comes out of the work from the EU Commission.
So a little bit wait and see from your side. Right, wonderful. Georgina, is there anything you'd like to add in this area?
Well, to slightly take it back to a higher level, perhaps just worth noting that I think the debate between level playing field versus commercial advantage is really interesting, and what's the right balance between the two? Because clearly, if you want to create markets, there has to be the opportunity to make money, or it'll be less interesting as a proposition for people. At the same time, if it's completely unfair, that won't work either. And I do think that this is an area where we do need collective engagement, because I don't think that individuals working on their own are going to make anywhere near the kind of progress we need to make in order to hit the targets. So finding the right balance for those two things is a really interesting question. And sadly, I'm afraid I don't have the answer.
No, and indeed, I think it is a very difficult one to answer, and it's a question our audience has been putting too. Our audience has been asking very much, who should be paying the bill at the end of the day for this?
Yeah.
Because it's a big question to answer, isn't it? Who actually should be financing those policies? I mean, clearly, as you mentioned, it can't be one or the other. It has to be a partnership or a combination. But the exact balance of that is very much an open question, a difficult one to answer, I think. Although even if it may be a difficult one to answer, I'll ask Alistair and Peter, and even possibly Bjorn, just to comment briefly on that before we wrap up.
Just a very quick comment from me regarding the cost of this. So the modelling that we've run suggests for something as complicated as a car, you're looking at less than kind of 1 or 2% added to the sticker price on a forecourt for a full zero carbon in all materials solution, through kind of both modest cost increases that they can be kind of socially managed, so that they don't lead to kind of perverse outcomes, through things like the tax systems. That it's entirely credible to foresee products that with relatively modest increases in price could be brought to market on a net zero basis. So I'll leave it there.
Okay. Peter, what do you think?
Yeah, I was just going to make a similar point. It depends whether your business is capable of passing through the costs to the final consumer. The car manufacturer can. They're the price maker for many of these things. They can say to European steel, what are you offering? But if it's a clean product and they don't like the price, they might turn to a dirty product just because it's cheaper. Okay, so it depends if you're a price taker or a price maker. But an industry like steel or aluminium or other non-ferrous, they tend to be caught with a global commodity price, which they do not control, and that squeezes them when they're trying to produce things that are cleaner, for which the market is not paying them any different from the classic product. So we have to get to a stage, and this goes back to LME and hydro really, we have to get to the point before too long where doing it the right way is the normal, not the premium product, if you like.
Yeah, it's an important threshold, isn't it, to reach? And I think you identify it well. There will come a time, I think, driven by consumer pressure as well, by good regulation, by company action, by players in the market, responsible players in the market, reach that critical threshold in which, as you say, it becomes the norm rather than the exception. And then obviously then you breach an important Rubicon, if you like, where the whole thing becomes easier. But do you accept that we're not there yet? And obviously that we need the right kind of actions to get there, because clearly we're not quite at that point yet where it's all come together. Hence our debate a little today. Bjorn, is there anything you'd like to add to that briefly?
Oh, I can confirm that when you look at the cost in the end product, when we are looking at some of our kind of abatement costs, it's small, and also the further down in the value chain you're doing these kind of mitigation the cost of the mitigation projects, the smaller it will be, because there are many steps in the value chain, especially in the aluminium, and several steps after the aluminium has left our plant as well. So I think that the cost is not really that big, and that's why I think this is more kind of a classic, or not classic, but similar to, it's more like a market failure, because and that's why we need more information, more transparency. And I think public procurement could probably be one of the most powerful tools to kind of get this development going, because we need someone that kind of takes the first step and also creates a bit of a market that is not a niche market, but also actually kind of commands some sort of power in the market and says, this is the way we're going, and then everyone needs to follow. So it needs to, I think this is, I agree with Peter saying it, because we need to get this, if we're really going to get to zero in 2050, we can't do that by niche products. Yeah, it needs to be the mass market that's actually asking for this.
Yeah, we need to reach that critical threshold, if you like. Right, I'm keeping an eye on time now, everybody. So our opening question was, how can we start creating demand for low carbon and sustainable products in Europe? Well, thank you, all four of you. You've put forward a lot of points already on this across such diverse areas as low carbon materials versus sustainability overall, right through to addressing high polluting global production from players like China. I'll give you just a minute each now, and a minute and no more, just to give us your takeaway from today, maybe your summary comments or your call to action that you want to leave in this debate, just to close things up for our audience and for you, our speakers. We'll take the same order as we started with today. So Alistair first, then Georgina, Bjorn, and then finally from you, Peter. So Alistair, over to you for some closing comments or a brief closing call to action.
Thanks, David. So it's really, the takeaway from this discussion is that we need to recognize this is a transition. And we mustn't let kind of trying to create the perfect set of policies, perfect set of kind of markets, get in the way of actually making progress. We must make progress in the next 10 years, and we must kind of, to take Georgina's statement, kind of enter into a bit of a price discovery kind of mode on this, and actually just make progress, and knowing it will be imperfect as data and market reporting improves over time. But we must do one thing, which is make progress ahead of the 2030 milestone.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Alistair. So, Georgina?
Thanks, David. Yeah, I think, look, what's clear is there's a huge amount of fantastic work that's happening, and lots of people working towards great outcomes. I think us remaining in touch, sessions like this are so important, because the danger is that we end up working in silos and not collaborating where possible, which not only potentially wastes effort, but also means that people end up doing the same set of work twice without needing to. So thank you for organising today. It's fantastic. And I agree absolutely with Alistair. It's imperfect at the moment. We're about to get a huge amount of data coming out of various initiatives. So working through, finding out what's important, what the market can really usefully absorb will be the next really important step. So we've got those challenges ahead.
Indeed, nice challenges to have, and I think we'll all be following the progress of your aluminium platform with great interest over the coming period as well.
Thank you.
Up to you. What are you going to leave us with?
No, I think, as I mentioned in my introduction, regulation has been important for the achievements in the heavy industry for the last 30 years. I think regulation will be important for the next 30 years, but then different regulation. I think we should start with one is transparency, and two, public procurement. I think those two levers are probably the easiest one to get things going, and then we need to build as we go along.
Okay, noted and noted. And finally, Peter, over to you.
Well, Europe will do its part in creating a predictable pathway, which is over the long term to 2050 and beyond. What I would like to leave is, it's not enough for the mining and the metal sectors to say we can make things cleaner if there's no market for it. So for me, the key thing is that those downstream sectors, which are closest to the final consumer, car manufacturers, producers of buildings, producers of machines, they're the ones who need to say what they expect all the way up the value chain. They need to be looking much further than their tier one risks. Just as Tesla's doing, they're saying we'll go to the mines because we need to control our long-term security of supply. We need to control our costs, and we need to control the ESG, which is an important part of our brand these days. So much more strategic thinking from downstream companies, I think, will help a long way.
Okay. Well, at this stage, I'm going to bring things to a close, everybody. I want to give a very warm thank you on behalf of Eurometaux and also myself as moderator to all four of you, our speakers, for your contributions today. A very big thank you also to our big audience that's been following various lockdown locations around Europe and the world. And my last comment, just to finish things off, is join us tomorrow for the fourth of our 5 raw material dialogues, where we're going to turn our target and our aim towards circular economy. And how should Europe advance its metal circular economy leadership by 2030? So join us tomorrow, same time, same place, online at 1 o'clock. For the fourth of our 5 debates. I wish you all a very wonderful afternoon. Again, a final thank you to all our speakers, and goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, David.